So I'll continue. So let's just talk again briefly about hormones. So what are hormones, which is really like a critical question that people will ask. They're chemical messengers that control and coordinate activities in the body. The release of these hormones is controlled by the nervous system. As I was talking about earlier, I spoke about for women, the estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen is really a very critical hormone for women because it actually controls their overall cycle, for their reproductive cycle. And so let's just explore what some of the issues, hormonal issues, could be, say for young women, right? There is this Time magazine article that talks about early puberty, that girls are now growing up really faster. And the question is whether is it hormones or what is it in the water, is it in the milk? So there are some critical issues that are beginning to demonstrate the hormonal effects in puberty. For example, the younger onset of menses, irregular periods, extremely heavy periods, this cramping, PMS from the beginning, insulin resistance, PCOS. PCOS, the big one, which is the polycystic ovarian syndrome that most women are demonstrating in the early years. And then there's early breast development, which is almost starting at 8 years old. So these are all signs that there are real issues for women at the hormonal level. And these are things that we would investigate in a lot of our diagnosis. For women in their 20s and 30s, there are issues of PMS, yeast or candida, infertility, pregnancy issues, fatigue, anxiety, depression, weight gain, poor diet, insulin, even cancer. And in the middle years for women, there's adrenal stress, there's allergies, there's fibromyalgia, there's menopause, there's sleep disorders, lots of issues around, and then there is death. Estrogen hormones are responsible for the growth and development of female sexual characteristics and reproduction. Estrogen comes in 3 groups: estrone, estradiol, and estriol. Estrone, the E1, so we typically measure all of this in our Dutch test that actually looks deeply and then makes prescriptions around each of these estrogen components. So we have the E1, which is about 10%. It's considered a strong estrogen because of its ability to cause cell proliferation. Then we have estradiol, which is E2, which is another 10% of the overall estrogen component, which is considered to be the strongest estrogen because of its ability to cause cell proliferation, right? Both of them causing cell proliferation, but it's stronger than E1. E3 is actually the most part of estrogen, and that's the estriol. It's about 90%. It's considered a weak estrogen because it does not cause cell proliferation. However, estriol appears to balance the cell proliferating effects of estrone and estradiol, providing protection against their cancer-causing ability. So this is a very important issue as we explore cancer and estrogen in women. Okay? And so estrogen has real big effects overall for women's sexual health. And we would explore some of those things in detail. There are certain challenges when estrogen is elevated or is depressed. So typically when we look at the measurements for estrogen, we'll be looking at E1, E2, E3, and we will be looking at where those levels appropriately sit. And when they're elevated, typically there's ovarian or adrenal dysfunction. There's a reduced detox of estrogen, which is the extraction of estrogen from the circulation. There's increased fat tissue. There's Xeno Estrogen, which is exposure to chemicals that mimic estrogen found in plastics and other chemicals. As in our last lecture yesterday, we were talking about toxicity. So that's an important issue around that. Then it's also increased aromatase activity due to factors such as age, insulin, and alcohol. So when we look at the challenges that are caused, that overall the environment has on estrogen, we begin to see that chemicals have shown to have significant impacts on the estrogenic effects inside the body of women. So toxicity can arise from things like the car exhaust, hormones in meat and dairy, soaps, shampoos and lotions, carpet, countertops, paneling, furniture, new car smell, which you all love, fruits and vegetables sprayed with plastic, right, like apples and things to preserve them, and then food dyes, right, when we put dyes into food, right? So an associate director of science policy at the FDA office did say that the regulations mandated in the 1958 assumed that all plastics migrate toxins into the food they contact. Migration is the movement of free toxins from plastic into the substances they in this case, it's your food. The manufacturer must prove that the migrations fall within acceptable ranges. We're looking here at the impact of hormones that have been included in meat, and those are called Xeno Estrogens. These hormones are linked ever more closely to the escalating incidence of reproductive cancers. So the whole area of estrogen excess, when your E1, your E2 and E3 numbers are high, there are strong linkages to cancer and a lot of other irregularities. And when you tend to have what we call those high levels of estrogen, you then suffer from what we call an estrogen dominance, which is also at the root cause of a lot of illnesses, which I've mentioned and talked about in. So I think I've spent enough time talking about estrogen. Are there any comments or questions on estrogen? Dr. Yi, do you have some comments on estrogen? Being an expert estrogen carrier? I caught Dr. Yi unawares. Sorry?
If you're low on estrogen, do you add estrogen?
You have to, because they have to be at the right levels. So one of the things that our test results, we're going to be looking at some of these test results. Somebody's phone. So we're going to be looking at these test results, and they give us a range for the test for the estradiol, which is the E2, which is the strongest one. You tend to want to measure the strongest. Remember, what does the E3 do again? It balances the E1 and the E2. And what do the E1 and E2 do? Cell proliferation, right? And so the E3 balances them, right? So they give us a range where they need to be at, so it's not over and it's not under. That's very important for regulating. Then we also have measurements for progesterone. Progesterone, which is our second hormone we're going to discuss for women's health, is a counter hormone to estrogen. Progesterone is a byproduct of cholesterol synthesis. Progesterone levels fluctuate through the female life cycle. Low levels can be caused by adrenal issues and luteal insufficiency. Right? Lots of functions for progesterone. It balances estrogen, just as E3 does. It prevents estrogen from overproducing uterine lining buildup. It ripens the uterine lining to allow for pregnancy. Maintains and protects the fetus. So we can go on. and you begin to get a sense of why progesterone is also such a very, very important hormone in the underlying reproductive life cycle for women. It's interesting that I'm focusing a lot of this hormone conversation around the woman life cycle, because the reproductive life cycle is actually the most complex architecture that the hormones manage within a human being. Progesterone deficiency is almost very similar to estrogen deficiency in that it causes a lot of issues like fibroids, endometriosis, spotting, or depression, hot flashes. It causes a lot of problems, right? There's a 1994 Newsweek article that said, as a result, the estrogen mimics can trick the body into turning off or ratcheting up certain biochemical pathways, especially those in the reproductive system. The result, sexual development in both males and females gone seriously askew. So you begin to wonder whether the rise in gender fluidity is maybe a hormonal imbalance issue in the culture, right? But we know that in ancient China, we didn't have such gender challenges, right? Yara, did we have gender fluidity issues during the Ming Dynasty? For one thing, since 1938, sperm counts of men in the US and 20 other countries have plunged by an average of 50%. At the same time, testicular cancer has tripled. Now, physicians are analyzing studies that link estrogen-like pollutants to breast cancer and endometriosis. Perhaps the oddest thing about endometriosis is that there were only 21 reported cases in the world 70 years ago. Today, there are over 5 million in the US alone. You begin to then wonder when that gender fluidity is a hormone crisis in disguise. Right? Take a break. How are we doing? You guys